Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us for today's center seminar. You get me instead of our usual student crew because all the students are either on a ship or somewhere outside of KAUST or under the weather at the moment. So I'm here to introduce our speaker, and today we have just one, and he's going to talk about a few different aspects of how recreational fishing has helped improve and can continue to help improve our understanding of Red Sea fish. And so uh, Collin originally graduated from the University of Alabama in the US with two majors in biology and marine science. And after he studied that degree, then he went and rode around in Alaska on as a fishing observer for a couple of years, I think, and I think saw some pretty interesting things in that time, and then decided for a small change of scenery from Alaskan fishing boats, he decided to come to the Red Sea, where things are a little bit calmer most of the time and a little bit warmer all of the time. And so Collin did his master's degree here and did his master's thesis looking at the bonefish, which is a very popular fishing target in most parts of the world, but probably under targeted here um, as a potential sort of recreational fishery. But Collin has always been very interested in a combination of science and management, science that is useful for management and that can help us make good decisions in terms of conservation and policies. And so his work reflects that. He's been involved in a lot of different projects related to fish movement and fish identification and life history of fish and so on. It just coincidentally happens that Collin also loves fish, that he is a very avid fisherman. As some might use the term piscatology, which is actually the study of fishing, as opposed to ichthyology, which is the study of fish itself. And so there's a few people on campus who probably fall somewhere in that realm of piscatorial ichthyologists, and I think that we'll see an example of that here. And so with that, I hope most of you know Collin. If you haven't met him before, here's Collin, and he'll tell you about fishing and how we interact with the recreational fishermen. So thanks, Collin.
Thank you for the introduction, Mike. So as Mike mentioned, I really, really like to go fishing. And that has kind of blurred the line between my personal and professional life. This is because a lot of the skills and the knowledge that I use as a fisherman, I also use as a scientist. Now, I've spent much of the last 3 years studying the biology of fish here in the Red Sea, but also engaged as an active recreational angler, learning about the fishery here in Saudi Arabia. This puts me in a unique situation where I have one foot in the world of recreational fisheries and another firmly planted in...
Sorry.
Yes.
You have to stand between here and here. You can stand here.
All right.
This is your space.
This is where I live. All right. So yes, I have one foot in the world of recreational fisheries and another firmly planted in the world of fisheries science. Today, I'm going to speak with you about how my two worlds have collided. I'll begin by giving a brief introduction to the fish and fisheries of the Red Sea, followed by a few examples of how fishing has helped us learn a little bit more about the animals that occur here. So before we get into the fish, we need to think a little bit about the environment. Now, the Red Sea is interesting for a multitude of reasons, but perhaps its most interesting feature is its near total isolation from other marine environments. The Red Sea is what we call a semi-enclosed basin, and it is essentially surrounded by land on all sides, except for a small man-made passage, the Suez Canal in the north and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait in the south. And this affects the distribution of some fish species, like this small filefish on this top map, whose distribution is exclusively in the Red Sea, It's what we call a Red Sea endemic. And then there's other species of fish, such as this large pelagic wahoo, which is known to occur broadly throughout the world in pelagic environments, but is not known to occur in the Red Sea. Now, we can think of the Red Sea as an almost distinct ecological unit in many ways. And this makes understanding the presence of fish in the Red Sea versus outside of the Red Sea more significant than understanding the presence of fish in two separate locations, say along a continuous piece of coastline. Now, for scientists trying to understand the distribution of fish species in the Red Sea, fisheries are a great resource. This picture here was taken at the Jeddah Fish Market, and this is the first bonefish that I saw here in Saudi Arabia. It actually led me to start looking for them in the wild and ultimately turned into my master's thesis, as Mike mentioned. But you can see in the background, there's several other fish species. And you can imagine maybe walking through one of these markets and being able to develop a good understanding of what fish occur in an area based on what is caught. So I've mentioned recreational fisheries, but what is a recreational fishery? For the most part, fisheries here in the Red Sea are dominated by commercialized artisanal fisheries. And that just means that the participants of the fishery are fishing to make a living. They catch a fish, they bring it to market and sell it. The artisanal component just refers to the gear they use. They're not using advanced industrial fishing equipment. Whereas recreational fisheries are conducted by participants who make their living elsewhere. And they fish either to put food on their table and have something to eat, or just to have fun and release the fish. Understanding the motivations behind why people fish is important because it can affect the areas in which they fish. If we think about the commercial fisheries here in the Red Sea, they mostly occur on the reefs. And this is because these fishers want to catch as many fish as they possibly can, so they go out to the reef, drop a hand line down, and catch reef fish all day. Whereas many recreational anglers don't even have a boat, and say on a Friday or Thursday after work, they want to go catch some fish, they'll walk along the mangroves or around docks, and they'll target these more coastal environments where there might not be as many fish. Also, some recreational anglers are focused on catching the biggest fish they possibly can, where they'll take their boats way past the reef and target large pelagic fish such as tunas. And I just mention this because by fishing in different environments, the fisheries are likely encountering different species. So while commercial fishers bring their catch to market, recreational fishers bring their catch to Instagram. Last year, I pulled out my phone and mindlessly opened Instagram to find that several people had sent me this picture of an Indo-Pacific tarpon that was supposedly caught in Jeddah. I was fascinated because I had been fishing here for a while and I had never seen or heard of anyone catching the species before. So I dug a little bit deeper. Was this the first time an Indo-Pacific tarpon had been documented in the Red Sea? My first stop was the checklist of Red Sea fishes. This is essentially a publication which lists all the fish species that have ever been documented in the Red Sea and provides a citation. What I found was that, yes, the Indo-Pacific tarpon was known to occur here, but there was only one citation, and I decided to dig a little bit deeper. What I found was this publication, which was really a fisheries identification guide from the 1980s that had really broadly just said that the Indo-Pacific tarpon occurred in every coastal area in the region. And this was definitely not evidence of occurrence in the Red Sea. But I thought maybe this map was informed from some other data that wasn't included in the checklist. I went a step further and I dug through several biodiversity databases, which compile georeferenced data from publications on species. It also takes information on the location of specimens that are deposited in museums, as well as iNaturalist data. And what I found is there were no documented instances of this species in the Red Sea. What you'll see is that this species is very well documented, denoted by these orange and red squares, all throughout Southeast Asia and Northern Australia, as well as the Southwestern Indian Ocean. And these are areas which receive a lot of precipitation for the most part. And we know that Indo-Pacific tarpon like to associate with estuaries and freshwater inputs. And you'll also notice that the area where we lack a lot of information is a fairly arid region. I thought this was really interesting, and I thought there was a cool story to tell, so I contacted the guy on Instagram, and he got back to me, and apparently this tarpon was in his freezer. So I drove down to Jeddah and collected the tarpon from him, and I guess word got out that people were trading Reef Ecology Lab stickers for tarpon carcasses, because a week later, someone else reached out to me, and I wound up with 2 tarpon specimens. Victor and Lucia helped me sequence them, and we have some planned work to look a little bit more at the genetic material, but we were able to genetically identify that this was an Indo-Pacific tarpon in the Red Sea for the first time, and also document that they can occur in these very arid regions. Thinking about this in a little more detail in relation to where these tarpon were actually captured, I'm sorry this isn't particularly visible, but the location of the tarpon captures is denoted by a small red circle, and we'll see that one of the tarpon was caught smack dab in the middle of Jeddah, while another was caught at the very far back end of Ubpur Creek. And these are very developed areas. There's no natural vegetation. These species typically use for shelter and foraging. But these are also areas where fresh water is known to enter the Red Sea. And if you think about where human settlements are along the Red Sea, this information can tell us a little bit about the threats that these species are facing, or at least this particular species is facing. Human settlements tend to accumulate around freshwater inputs, and so that's the same location that the species likes to occur. And so while habitat degradation is likely a threat for this species, this also puts them in close proximity to fishermen. There are 2 less tarpon in Jeddah today. I think this is a really interesting example of how recreational fisheries can provide us with new insights into fish biology, and also tell us a little bit about the threats that these organisms are facing. So, riding the high of my tarpon discovery, I started thinking about this idea of the spatial overlap of fisheries and how there weren't many commercial fisheries targeting the pelagic environment. So I went back to Instagram looking for pelagic fishes in the Red Sea. And what I found was the account of Dr. Marwan. Dr. Marwan is a retired dentist in Aqaba, Jordan, who now owns a big game fishing charter and takes people out on tours on the weekends. The reason I was drawn to Dr. Marwan's page was this picture of him holding a wahoo. Now, if you remember the 2 maps of species distributions that I presented earlier, the wahoo was the bottom panel. This species is not known to occur in the Red Sea. So I messaged Dr. Marwan and was asking about where he caught this fish. And in fact, he caught this in the Gulf of Aqaba, which I found extremely interesting. But just as I thought it couldn't get any cooler, he sent me this picture, which is one of his friends who had caught a striped marlin in the Gulf of Aqaba. And this is the first marlin species to ever be documented in the Red Sea as well. So in 5 minutes of messaging this dude on Instagram, I discovered 2 new records in range extensions for pretty large fish. And I think this is kind of crazy that these large animals, over 2 meters in length, are moving around in the waters around us, and we have no idea that they're there until now. Also, the location in the Red Sea they were documented is pretty interesting. This wasn't just inside the Red Sea in Yemen or somewhere. This is at the farthest north corner of the Red Sea. So there's a few theories as to why these fish have evaded our detection for so long. And one idea is that these were just vagrants, and it was just 1 or 2 fish that came in, and this isn't a regular thing. But in my conversations with Marwan, I've discovered that they catch these fish regularly at certain times of the year. So these fish occur in the Red Sea regularly, but we're just not finding them. Also, these species could be misidentified or confused with other similarly looking species, such as large mackerels or sailfish. But in any case, it is pretty strange that such a big animal has gone undocumented for so long. Something I've also thought about is perhaps climate change is pushing fish, and especially pelagic fish, which follow fronts and certain water masses of certain temperatures. It's pushing them further away from the equator as the equator gets too warm. And perhaps that's driving pelagic fishes and large pelagic fishes, which can migrate long distances, northwards into the Red Sea. In any case, I think this is another really interesting instance where recreational fisheries can provide us with some new insights into fish distributions. But so what? Some people caught some weird fish somewhere else. What about KAUST? When I first arrived at KAUST, I obviously did a lot of fishing, and I kept encountering this weird species of sea bream with the yellowfin. It kind of looked like some other species that we knew were around, but I wasn't totally sure. So I took a tissue sample and sequenced part of its DNA and totally forgot about it. I got busy with my master's and it just sat in the back canals of my computer. That was until KAUST's very own Vice President of Research, Donald Bradley, sent us this picture. Donald Bradley is another active recreational fisherman, and he had caught these two fish on campus, and he asked us what species they were. Our answer was that we really didn't know. And so Victor and Lucia got to work in the lab and sequenced a portion of the DNA from these two fish and came to a similar conclusion as I did, that it didn't really match with anything. So to prove our theory that this was potentially a new species, we needed more samples. And as much as I love to go fishing, using a fishing pole isn't the most efficient way to catch a bunch of fish. So we constructed this trap right off of North Beach, which consists of rebar, PVC, and some plastic fencing. We threw a bunch of cut shrimp in the middle, and as fish were attracted to it, they would be led into the center of the trap and couldn't escape. That allowed us to block off the entrance when we arrived and collect all the fish we needed. And it worked really well. We collected a whole bunch of fish, and this panel represents all of the fish within this genus in the Western Indian Ocean. The species that we're finding on KAUST is represented in the top two panels, A and B, and everything else is just known to occur in the region. What Victor and Lucia found was that the fish we find on campus looks very similar superficially to some of the other species in the region, particularly those in panels E and F. But when they looked closer, they found morphological differences. But also, when they compared the DNA sequences to those in the region, they found something completely different. And this confirmed our theory that this was, in fact, a new species. We're in the middle of publishing this. I have to admit, my contributions have dropped off since the fish were captured, and Victor and Lucia have been doing most of the work. But we're working to publish this and describe a new species, Acanthopagris o'conneri. On this phylogenetic tree, you can see the largest portion, which is a light yellow or orange, is the species which is distinct from several other that we have sequences for. Thinking about this is also very crazy. We have a very well-established marine research center here on campus. And for over a decade, some of the best scientists were spending their time at a beach surrounded by an undescribed species that's fairly big. This isn't some small little snail that no one's looking for. This is something you can see from the beach. So this really illustrates that there's still a lot to learn about Red Sea fish biology, and that recreational fisheries can help bring some of these new findings to light. While describing new species and examining range extensions for species can be very exciting, it's often very opportunistic. So when I was a part of the founding of the KAUST Fishing Club, I started thinking about more reliable ways to collect data on the fish that people were catching. And one of our first ideas was to start a mark recapture tagging program. Consists of putting a small identification tag on a fish that has contact details and an ID number. And then if anyone catches the fish again, we're able to determine how far the fish moved and how much it grew. Here's an example of me applying a dart tag to a giant trevally. It might look a little invasive, but it's the fish equivalent to getting your ears pierced. This tag latches onto the dorsal spines and anchors there, and so it doesn't fall out when the fish is swimming. And this project is still in its infancy, but we've tagged over 60 fish here on campus, which are represented by these dark red circles, everywhere from the monument down to South Beach. I think at this point we've tagged over 15 species as well. And last year we had our first recapture, which is Lethrinus lintjan, the pink ear emperor. We tagged this right off of the IRC, as you can see at the start of this arrow. And then it was recaptured about 60 days later by a coastline recreational fishing charter just past the Coast Guard station here in the bottom left of the map. And while this fish did wind up on a barbecue, it gave us some data before it did. This is actually the first any movement information of any kind for this species, which I think is pretty significant. As scientists and coastal managers are designing marine protected areas, they often use information like this to inform their decisions. Say a group was trying to design a 2 square kilometer MPA, they would know that they weren't protecting the species, which is good and important information to have when making those decisions. Although this information is pretty limited, I expect this project to keep going for long after my time here at KAUST. And through time, I expect us to have many more recaptures of different species and really develop a larger data set that's more useful and relevant to management. So recreational fisheries here in Saudi Arabia are growing. And I've seen this just in the past few years that I've been here. There's more people on campus that are joining the sport. There's more shops opening up in Jeddah. People are traveling to other parts of the Red Sea and different countries to go spend money and take their vacation and catch cool Red Sea fishes. And I really expect this to keep happening in the future, especially in Saudi Arabia. I'm sure all of you are very well aware of Vision 2030, which seeks to diversify Saudi Arabia's economy in part by increasing tourism. And one thing that people love to do while on vacation is go fishing. So I think that the rise of recreational fisheries and the objectives of the kingdom are quite closely related. And in many cases, I think recreational fisheries, perhaps in certain areas, might even replace commercial fisheries. This has happened in governments and countries in other parts of the world where they figure out that someone coming to catch a fish and paying for a hotel and buying food and flights makes these fish worth more alive than they are dead in a market selling for 20 SAR. So while fisheries can sometimes appear to be counterproductive or opposing to conservation measures, I argue that in many cases, if managed correctly, recreational fisheries, especially when imposing catch and release practices, can be a force of good for enacting new conservation measures for these species. But like I've given several examples of earlier, they can also help us learn a little bit more about these organisms in ways that we would otherwise have no access to. So with that, I'll wrap things up and take any questions you might have.
Thanks, Collin. Questions? Can I throw that or pass it over?
Firstly, I just want to say thanks for your talk. I thought that was so interesting. And I think you've really managed to tap into a great resource with Instagram. Like a striped marlin, that's amazing. My question is related to the tarpon. I don't personally know a lot about fish, but is that one of the species that can actually breathe air?
Yes, they do gulp air. I'm actually not particularly familiar with the mechanisms in which they do that, but they are, especially in their juvenile stages, they're known to occur in backwaters that are very anoxic. And in those conditions, they can incorporate a little bit of oxygen into their system by gulping for air. And that's thought to enable the juveniles to evade predators that are in deeper, more circulated and mixed waters.
So that's kind of what I was thinking, like maybe even though they're in this really built up area in Jeddah, maybe that adaptation allows them to utilize an environment that maybe other fish can't really live in because the water quality is bad or something like that.
That's a really good point. I hadn't considered that. So it might be a threat, but also it might allow them to access resources that other predators can't.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. But yeah, I thought that was
Yeah.
really cool. So thank you.
Yeah, cool idea.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. Your enthusiasm is really, I think, also engaging the audience. What I was wondering is with this Mark Recapture program that you're setting up, what is the average lifespan of these species you're targeting? Because if that's short, it won't be very efficient. But if it's long-lived species, the data is worth a lot more, I think, or much more potential.
Yes, so it's hyper variable. Some of the smaller species we tag, I think the maximum they've been recorded growing, say like a small coral hind or a Hemistichtus grouper, the yellowfin grouper, I think their maximum age is, or their average max is about 6 years. But other species like bohar can live up to 60 years. Some of these GTs that we're tagging are known to live well over 20 years. So it is hyper variable. We're kind of using the shotgun approach to just tag everything we catch. And if we are able to recapture it, then it provides us with some useful data. But yes, if we were specifically targeting a lot of species that didn't live very long, then we would just be putting tags on them for almost no reason, and it wouldn't give us a whole lot of information.
Yeah, thank you. That answer.
I can catch. Yeah, thanks, Collin. It was a lot of fun. I was curious. You mentioned, I think it was with the marlin. You talked about one of the speculations that some of these fishes might be moving away from the equator due to climate change. But even with that, the Red Sea is still much warmer than the coastal Africa and the Yemeni Omani coast, where we get a lot of upwelling, very high productivity. So I'm wondering, it doesn't seem to me like temperature would be a driver there. The other possibility is that the Arabian Sea is extremely low in oxygen, and that low oxygen can occur within 100 meters of the surface. So I'm wondering, and hypoxic regions globally are expanding. So I'm just curious, any thoughts on that? As I say, temperature-wise, I don't see the Red Sea as being a refuge. It's still warmer than everything outside of the Gulf of, or the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb.
I'm actually really glad you asked that. I had not considered oxygen as being a potential driver of fish into the Red Sea. I honestly had not thought into it in that capacity in terms of the differences between, I guess, non-climate related differences in temperature between the Red Sea and surrounding areas. But yes, I do think that, especially the marlin and the wahoo, they are known to dive pretty deep. And if you have these expanding oxygen poor regions, perhaps these fish see those areas or stay away from those areas because they are unable to access their prey in deeper water. And perhaps that could push them into the Red Sea, which is a little bit better mixed and has higher oxygen at depth. So I think that's a really interesting point, something that I hadn't considered.
Any other questions?
How many people belong to the KAUST Fishing Club?
Ooh, I think last time I
So the
checked,
question for the people on Zoom, the question was how many people belong to the KAUST Fishing Club?
yes, David, you might be able to help me with this. Last I checked, I think it was 119. It might be more.
Yeah, you should all sign up.
So we have big plans. David is spearheading a lot of those efforts to create some new places to fish and tag fish on campus. And the idea is to mostly be catch and release fishing and enable this project that we're working on to collect more data.
Can you say something about world records?
World records.
Yeah. So a lot of these species are not recorded in the world record registries.
Yes.
And so if somebody catches a Red Sea endemic fish, it by default becomes a world record until somebody catches something bigger, right?
Yes, among recreational fishermen, there's an organization that's the International Game Fish Association, and they keep records on the biggest fish caught using different line classes and for men and women and children. And so a lot of recreational fishermen, just as a way to track what fish they're catching and achieve certain things, will chase world records. And another thing that might drive people to come to the Red Sea to go fishing is the fact that there are endemic species here, such as the nodule, the large coral grouper. So you don't have to catch a really large fish which are more rare, to potentially set a world record and get that nice certificate you can put on your wall. Yes.
A question from Aislinn.
Do you have any plans to work with fishers from Cake or Jeddah? Any recreational boats to do tagging as well?
We've spoken with some in the past. I think it can be difficult to set up an official relationship with them. And I think we've had problems with people cycling out. I think relationships have been established and then those people have moved on. And so we do have some plans to work with tour operators for other things. But right now we're really focusing on campus. And then in the future, if that works really well, we'll expand to other places. But we're trying to work through all our kinks right now and really develop it and kind of refine the way that we work with people outside of our lab, and then maybe apply that to other locations. But a natural extension would be, fishing operators in Cake and Jeddah. Nice catch.
Thanks, Collin, for the excellent talk. You mentioned that some countries had transitioned away from commercial fishing and to recreational fishing. And I'm wondering, is there a body of knowledge related to that could be drawn from here to think about how either not necessarily that Saudi Arabia would entirely make that transition, but one of the big things that I see, with the fishing club and interacting with boat captains from Dual and other places, is that they definitely do not view the fish as being more valuable alive than dead. And so, but I think they very much are more valuable alive than dead. So it's how, but making that argument is tricky, especially because you're trying to make it to a larger group of people in order to be effective. Like, you're converting one local boat captain from killing everything they catch to catch and release is not the change that you really need. You need a bigger change.
Yes. So thinking of examples of where that has happened successfully, we think about the Bahamas with Bonefish is probably the best example you can think of. The Bahamas have a lot of people that come over from the US and really from around the world to target bonefish, which I studied for my master's. And they're a really interesting fish. They live in shallow water. They swim super fast. And so this fishery developed in the Bahamas, bringing in a lot of tourism dollars. The government saw that. And they also saw that people were netting these fish in the same areas. People were paying thousands of dollars to go catch them. And so they designated bonefish as a game fish species, which means they're catch and release only. And so maybe that model could be applied for certain species like the big giant trevallies or Napoleon wrasse or bonefish or something here to maybe offer some species specific protections, which might be more viable than just closing off whole sections and big MPAs that are just recreational fishing. But the other thing I want to mention, which you kind of alluded to, is there's oftentimes an illogical lag. So the fishery has to develop enough, like to a point where the government and governing bodies can recognize it as valuable. But then people don't want to come to a place where there's highly extractive fisheries. So if you develop a fishery, it might not get big enough because there are no regulations in place. But a lot of times those regulations won't happen until there's a big enough catch and release fishery. So maybe there's ways to protect certain species that would allow a fishery to build up enough and then enact broader regulations.
So then a quick follow-up. So of the species that would normally be targeted as game fish in Saudi Arabia, would something like a giant trevally be a good candidate species for that? Like, is it valuable? Is it valuable to fishermen? I mean, do they catch a lot of it and does it sell for a good price in the market, or is it kind of a trash fish in terms of its market value anyway, and therefore they're not losing much by somebody stepping in and saying, don't kill any big GTs or something like that?
Yeah, I think it is almost a trash fish. A lot of times I see them, especially the big ones, guys don't want to buy them in the markets. They like those medium-sized fish they can put on someone's plate. So, and even trevallies are kind of lumped into this one group. They call it bayad, and it sells for pretty low value compared to grouper or wrasse, something like that. So I think it would be a good candidate. Also, triggerfish would be another good candidate. Yeah. They show up in the markets every now and then, and those are really crazy looking fish that are hard to catch in many places, but are quite abundant here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Hey, Collin, we have one chat question, actually. This is from Marine. It says, great talk, Collin. Could you talk a little bit about the survival of fish with catch and release practices? I understand it's a controversial subject.
It is controversial indeed. That's because there's a lot of variability. So a lot of times when you catch a fish, it has just been swimming harder than it ever has in its life. Some random thing got caught in its mouth and it's freaking out and it's swimming as fast as it can for minutes before you bring it in. And then you pull it out of the water and it can't breathe. And so that's very stressful for a fish. There's also certain aspects of the handling that can be harmful to the fish as well. But this has been studied for several species. While you can't completely alleviate post-release mortality, you can minimize it greatly by following a few practices, and that's keeping the fish underwater and as much as you can. So when we're tagging these fish, we keep them in a net for the most part submerged so they can still oxygenate their gills and breathe while we're working them up. We'll maybe pull them out for a quick picture, but you'll notice in a lot of these pictures, the fish are dripping wet. So it's just a quick up and down. Also, fish are covered in slime. And so that's their barrier. That's what protects them from the environment. And if you have some nice fishing gloves and grab the fish, you take all that slime off, and then the fish can get infected under its scales. So we oftentimes work with wet hands. And sometimes we'll even put a little bit of iodine on the location where the tag was. We also anti-foul the tags. We didn't do this at the start, but we started doing this so that no algae or anything builds up on the tags. There's a few other components that I'm probably missing and I don't need to get into at all, but yes, post-release mortality is an issue and it happens, but there's a few practices you can follow to really reduce the likelihood of that happening.
Okay, well, let's give Collin another hand, and we'll see you again next seminar in a couple of weeks, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.